Now I am happy to introduce Dr. Adetola Jacques for the next talk on breastfeeding for mom's sake, which fits right in. Dr. Jacques completed her medical degree in 2010 at the University of Vermont College of Medicine in Burlington, and her OB-GYN residency at Lehigh Valley Health Network in Allentown, Pennsylvania. I've been to Allentown. Her maternal fetal medicine fellowship was completed at the University of South Florida, Morsani College of Medicine in Tampa, and she is currently an assistant professor and medical director of the midwifery, lactation, and doula services in the Department of OB-GYN at the University of Florida College of Medicine in Gainesville. Her work is focused on maternal benefits of lactation and dismantling barriers and eliminating disparities in lactation and maternal health. So let's welcome her presentation.
Hi, I'm so happy to be here today. I'm Adetola Jacques again. And thank you very much for the opportunity to have this discussion today. Let me share my screen. And could you see it earlier? Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Awesome. All right, so lactation for mom's sake, the birthing parent, lactating parent's sake. For my disclosures, I get research support from Merck for Mothers, Safer Childbirth Cities. That's for some of our doula interventions. The Robert A. Wing Career Development Award, which is industry sponsored, and I'm happy to discuss some of the sponsors for that if there are any concerns. The NSF, NIH, and University of Florida have sponsored some of my research. So my goals today are to discuss maternal health outcomes associated with lactation, explore molecular basis for long-term benefits of lactation, review breastfeeding rates and inequities in breastfeeding outcomes, and identify strategies to improve breastfeeding outcomes and promote equity. So breastfeeding really, as my mentor would say, Maureen Grower, that for maternal metabolism, pregnancy ends with weaning, not birth. And for the infant, lactation is an extension of pregnancy, the most personalized, whatever. We spend so much money, millions, billions, for personalized interventions. And for lactation, it can impact, there's so many things that can impact breast milk composition, from infant, behavioral, maternal. And so today, though, our focus is not on the infant, our focus is maternal, on the parent. So on this is just an ACOG infographic, just to see from maternal side, this is some of the things we commonly say. Breastfeeding burns as many as 500 extra calories each day. Birthing parents who breastfeed have lower rates of type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, heart disease, and breast cancer and ovarian cancer. And that because breastfeeding triggers the release of oxytocin and causes uterus to contract, that there may be decreased bleeding. There are lots of long-term benefits that have been reported in the literature, and I'm just going to share some of that with you. So for metabolic disease, metabolic syndrome, hyperlipidemia, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, hypertension, myocardial infarction. For cancer, there's been some report on endometrial and thyroid cancer, as well as the breast and ovarian that we all know, premenopausal ovarian. There's been some report on Alzheimer's disease, on endometriosis, rheumatoid arthritis, and multiple sclerosis. And that duration and dose and duration does matter. But this is an AHRQ report, and looking at just doing a full systematic review. These are the conditions that have been most robust, that breastfeeding is associated with reduced risk of breast cancer, ovarian cancer, hypertension, and type 2 diabetes. And it's also important to note that breastfeeding is not just nutrition or maternal self-sacrifice. Sometimes it almost feels like, why put all of that on the birthing parent? But as the video we just watched of just helping people meet their goals are critical too, and enabling optimal breastfeeding, which is defined by Bartik et al. Looking at a cohort of women through their lifetime. And optimal breastfeeding is at least 90% breastfeeding for 6 months exclusively in at least a year duration, which is changed with new guidelines, and we'll talk about it. That enabling optimal breastfeeding would prevent about 2,600 maternal deaths and 700 child deaths annually in the US. And it is a women's health issue, and not just the death. We see the amount of cases that could be prevented: 5,000 for breast cancer, 12,000 for type 2 diabetes, about 36,000 for hypertension, and about 8,500 for heart attacks. And it's a public health issue because even in high-income countries, infants who are not breastfed face higher risk of infectious and chronic diseases, and mothers who do not breastfeed or birth parents who do not breastfeed face higher risks of cancer and metabolic disease. And here's another way to look at it. And this is just summary of just that, the data from Bartik et al. In their article, Suboptimal Breastfeeding in the United States. And we can see here some of the cases we've talked about, some of the deaths averted. On this column is just overall, and we look at it per 100,000 women. But another way to think about this is the number needed to treat. And for high blood pressure, you can see here about 55 lactating, 55 postpartum individuals. But I think critical to note that a lot of what we're talking about is an association, that it's hard to pinpoint cause and effect, right? Because we know that breastfeeding is associated with improved maternal health, but there are several other factors that most of the studies, except for one, are observational studies, and the one was an indirect randomized trial. And so we have observational and not randomized trial because it will be unethical to randomize parents to breastfeed or not to breastfeed. That there are important demographic differences between people who fully breastfeed and those who do not. And that baseline metabolic health, like insulin resistance and obesity, can impact the ability to achieve full breastfeeding. So let's talk about just the breastfeeding rates globally. And so the World Health recommends that children initiate breastfeeding within the first hour of birth, that they be exclusively breastfed for the first 6 months, and breastfeed on demand, and that they should continue breastfeeding up to 2 years and beyond. And initially, some of our recommendations nationally had been 1 year, but recently it's all been now both ACOG and the guidelines for obstetrics and gynecology and pediatrics are now aligned with World Health. But let's look overall in the world. The exclusive breastfeeding rates are about 41%. And when we look throughout, very, very few achieve greater than 80%. We only have one country. And breastfeeding rate does matter. The leading causes of death in women are the non-communicable diseases are ischemic heart disease, stroke, COPD, type 2 diabetes, conditions that breastfeeding can impact and can be a key prevention. So some of the ways to improve some of these rates to enable optimal breastfeeding are the 10 steps suggested by World Health Organization. And some of what was described today in that video we watched, I think is critical in the conversation about kind of the things that enabled her. And bear with me, can you, 1 second. So having staff competency, helping support from prenatal period, providing immediate care postpartum, providing support through breastfeeding, helping with latch, giving practical advice, giving practical support, not just here are the benefits of breastfeeding. It's important for people to know, but it's critical for people to know how to, and having real practical support in doing this, and helping to address common breastfeeding challenges or problems. Providing supplementation when medically indicated, helping practicing ruminant, responsive feeding, helping parents know when their babies are hungry, and not limiting times to breastfeed. There's some conversations about bottles and pacifiers. And when you discharge parent, that you need to have robust community resources to help continue this journey. And another key area that the World Health Organization talked about was last year was that it's time to stop infant formula practices that endanger children. The formula milk industry spends billions each year to influence decision on how to feed babies. And what is spent in marketing overwhelms any global support for breastfeeding. And some of the ways this happen is through baby clubs that looks to be for breastfeeding support, but are ways to target for formula. Pinpoint marketing claims made without evidence, and targeting of health workers to encourage them to promote formula products. And I just want to be clear that this conversation is not about formula being bad, or the formula can be medically indicated, but understanding the strategy that's in the marketing and how it influences us and our patients. The Lancet also put out a series 2 months ago on this subject, on how on the importance of breastfeeding and how it is challenged in a market-driven world, and the marketing system, and just how to confront corporate power and structural barriers and accelerate progress. And some of the key structural factors that was noted noted globally are gender inequalities, where 649 million women who are working are not entitled to adequate maternity protection that support breastfeeding. Misleading advertising, the influence of commercial milk industry, as we've said before, funding and influencing health professionals, researchers, medical and academic organizations to promote their product and commercial interest. How this industry also impact and have a powerful lobby groups that influence policymaking. And socioeconomic inequality and neo-colonial wealth extraction. And essentially that 97% of the formula industry is owned by shareholders in high-income countries, but the harms are felt mostly in low-middle-income countries. And the economic interest of this multi-billion-dollar industry, and how that regulates some of attempts to and challenge attempts to regulate the marketing. And now we're going to move to the United States. Initially I put in here so you could see that it was first year, and now we've changed it to 2 years. And this is, again, not an effort to say everybody has to breastfeed for 2 years, but we want people who are able to breastfeed to have the support longer than 1 year to continue their breastfeeding journey. And so how far we've come is that for the 2020 breastfeeding goals nationally, we've met most of what we attempted to achieve. And now we are on 2030, the goals that were not achieved were in duration and exclusivity focus. So increasing the proportion of infants who are breastfed at 6 months, and here reducing the proportion of breastfed newborns who receive formula within the first 2 days. And so these are the 2030 goals to increase the proportion of infants who are breastfed exclusively through age 6 months, and proportions of infants who are breastfed at 1 year. And even that language is suggestive that, that infants are the focus of breastfeeding. They are an important piece of it, but so is the person in breastfeeding. Any breastfeeding by race ethnicity, here we're just going just a little bit more into the breakdown by race and ethnicity. And here we see throughout that non-Hispanic Black individuals have the lowest rates. The gap looks to be closing some, and Asian Americans have overall the highest rates. And this is for any breastfeeding. And when we look at breastfeeding rates, with any breastfeeding 6 months breastfeeding, 12 months duration, or exclusive at 3 and 6 months, we see that again, non-Hispanic Black individuals have the lowest rates. When we look at the 10 steps we discussed earlier, and that I'm not sure if you can see the top of my screen. Please let me know if that Zoom is blocking the titles. But these are maternity centers where they're likely to provide 10 steps. And you can see where there is greater than 12% Black residents. Greater is red and less is blue, that we see their 10 steps less likely to be practiced. And so why baby friendly for some of these outcomes, that it may reduce disparities in breastfeeding, and we can see some studies supporting that it provides consistent education and messaging for all parents, and emphasis on safety and most current evidence. And looking at some of that, this is Kimberly Stills-Allers on some of the disparities we have, and her view was at the root of what's happening to Black women and their birth outcomes, as well as the disparities with breastfeeding, is an issue of racism and bias. And why do these inequities matter? The breastfeeding inequities may contribute to other maternal child health outcomes. And here are examples where we look at the ratios of non-Hispanic Black individuals compared to non-Hispanic white, or Hispanic to non-Hispanic whites, and we see some of that ratio increasing. Type 2 diabetes, hypertension, heart attacks, and for Hispanic, we see this with high blood pressure, of the impact of disparities in breastfeeding on maternal and child health outcomes. So I guess not guess, but to proceed, we'll talk a little bit about just the next objective of how does lactation influence long-term health? And this has been some of my work that some of them are preliminary in progress, some are published. And just to start, I would share the reset hypothesis by Stubbe, where here we see pregnancies associated with insulin resistance, hyperlipidemia, visceral fat accumulation. And that if there's no lactation, metabolic changes of pregnancy may persist for a longer period. And persistence of this metabolic changes may increase lifetime cardiometabolic disease risk, or conversely, lactation may help reverse these pregnancy changes. So here are other thoughts. That differences in hormone levels like oxytocin, prolactin, lower levels or hyperestrogenic state, that the differences in the immune system, so activation of innate, downregulation of the adaptive immunity, decrease CRP levels while breastfeeding, some metabolic differences such as decreased lipid levels, decreased postpartum weight retention and adiposity, and there's some conflicting data with that. And we propose microbiome and epigenetics, and there's some of the things we're looking at. And we know that this is intricate, and we know that there are many, many factors that influence lactation, and many, many factors that can influence the conditions of interest, cardiometabolic disease and cancer. And that we know that we're assessing, does lactation influence microbiome? Does the microbiome influence epigenetic changes? Or does lactation influence epigenetic changes directly? And do these changes then in turn influence the cardiometabolic disease risk or cancer risk? And so the first I will talk about is epigenetics, knowing that there are multiple mechanisms to influence the expression, not the actual gene itself, but what's expressed. And one of the things we've looked at is DNA methylation. And when we looked at this DNA methylation, we did some pilot work where we saw a few genes of interest, a few methylation changes of interest, but it was preliminary, not validated yet. And so we looked at the same people, but we looked at multiple samples over 6 months postpartum. And we did see several changes based on feeding type. And when we looked at the differences, whether there was 10% or greater or 20% or greater, which 20% is a gold standard, we saw about 5 differentially methylated regions, that's the DMR. And we looked across many different models, just wanted to look many ways to see, is this true or not? And we saw some consistent genes, about 40 of them, through different type of pipelines of looking at the analysis. And then when we looked at if there's at least 10% of 10% change, and we correct for multiple testing, and that just means if you look at hundreds of thousands of things and you accept 5% will be correct, then you can falsely accept many things that are incorrect. So when we adjust for those for our multiple testing and look at least 10% change through many models of analysis, we see some consistent areas that are differentially methylated. And I'll talk a little bit about some of them. I'll come back to Y1, but this first gene we see in immune expressed with immune regulation in cancers. The ones in orange are the ones we found in our pilot work, and we're able to validate again. So protecting against apoptosis and innate immune system. And this is another gene that I tried, another gene with differentially methylated region that I ran away from because it was Alzheimer's. And I was like, what are we talking about? But it showed up again with neuroprotection against Alzheimer's disease, energy expenditure, and LDL and HDL. And I'm happy to go in depth, and hopefully this will be published later this year. But if there's any questions about details of this work, I'm happy to provide it. I didn't want to sink too deeply into it. And here's the roof Y1 again, and it shows, again, Alzheimer's disease, type 2 diabetes susceptibility, and cancer were some of the what's been associated with this gene methylation, or with this gene in general. We did some pathway analysis and immune system again, where the most of the pathways that we're seeing. And again, we weren't looking to see this, but we saw what my mentor, Dr. Gru, had been studying for a long time, and I'd seen from a clinical perspective of this upregulation and of the innate immune system, downregulation of the adaptive immune system, and that's what we saw in some of these pathways, and then brain development and transcription. And so I've like paused and not even approached the brain development piece of it because it's just wrapping my brain across what that means. And a key question with methylation studies is just what, so what? If you see differences in methylation, how do you know that is changing how the genes are expressed? How do you know it's affecting transcription and translation and bottom line of what's happening in the body? And so we looked at some of those pathways and some of our cytokines, and we do see some correlation in what is in the plasma. Another piece of our work, I'm just checking to make sure that I'm doing okay time-wise, was looking at lactation and microbiome. And why would we even think to look at that for maternal benefits? I think what triggered me was a study by Coran et al., where they looked at the gut microbiome from the first trimester to the third trimester and saw that there were changes. Remember the things we talked about, some of the insulin desensitization with the reset hypothesis, weight gain, increased adiposity. But as those things increased, there was an altered microbiota. And when they took pooled samples of of some of these women from the first trimester and the third trimester and put it into germ-free mice. And this is just a way to say, does the microbiome induce cardiometabolic change? Can we show that the microbiome is doing this? So that's part of some of that work. And please forgive any language that seems disrespectful. It's just a figure from the actual work in the paper. That there's
29 minutes left.
How many minutes left?
29.
Okay, thank you so much. That the stool transferred, the pooled sample transferred to the mouse, they had the phenotype were normal or expected. And when you took the transplant in the third trimester into mice, the germ-free mice, then you saw increased adiposity and you saw insulin desensitization. So thinking through that reset hypothesis, my thoughts were, what does that mean in lactation? And so some of the work, some of it is not final, and maybe one day I'll come back and give some a lot more as we've gone into depth. But does lactation influence maternal gut microbiome? Then what's the next step? And again, our thoughts of how this could happen was hormonal changes, energy expenditure, differences in host immunity, and inflammation. You can see so many things influencing the gut microbiome. And here, this is from an infant's perspective, but we're asking, what about from a maternal perspective? And then we proposed that lactation's physiological effects could lead to modification of the gut microbiome and altering energy expenditure, gut pH, and inflammation. That's how we're thinking this could be. And that if there are modifications, that the gut microbiome and its metabolites could have long-term health influences. And when we did look, comparing those who fully breastfed versus those who didn't fully breastfeed, and looking at 4 months or greater than 4 months, we did see differences in gut microbiome. And when we looked at greater than 4 months, we saw the differences were more pronounced, no matter which parameter. This is just kind of looking at the blue is the exclusive breastfeeding, the yellow is the non-exclusive breastfeeding, and just looking to see are there differences, and these are the p-values. And so we see differences in the first 2 parameters, looking at distances between this gut microbiome. And then when we look greater than 130 days, which is the median point of our data set, when we looked longitudinally at 100 women, we did see these differences throughout all parameters after 4 months. So this is kind of proceeding with some of that work is looking at healthy mothers, and we can talk through what that means, and looking at early postpartum and late postpartum, and taking some of the stool from those who fully breastfeed and those who do not into mice again to see what changes do we see. And essentially we're looking at, again, just a quick experimental model, and we can delve deeper into this as needed. We, instead of using germ-free mice model, which is much more expensive, and you need to have specific type of setting to be able to do it, we just give antibiotics to the mice and peg, and then transfer the stool. And we collected stool samples and plasma and cardiometabolic measures. I think overall, there's still a lot of work that we're doing here, a lot of analysis still being done, but that the food intake was not different, but that at the second time point, T2, we did see some differences with glucose tolerance test, moderate, nothing drastic, but we did see one. And the next steps for that work is to look at the microbiome, which we're doing right now, and looking at some of that analysis to see if there are differences, looking to see if some of that, the changes in the microbiome contributes to the differences that we see in some of our cardiometabolic measures. I just want to say there's a lot of things. We've looked at lactation and microbiome, still looking in a lot of detail, and lactation and epigenetics, but there are many, many other things we can look within these relationships about the immune system and how it contributes to the microbiome as well, just in general, looking at metabolites of the microbiome and how that modulates the epigenetic, the epigenome. And so many factors to look at. And beyond the omics study, so many other things we can look at to see, understand a little better of how does lactation influence the parent, and how does this changes we see epigenetic wise, how is that really affecting what's produced from transcription, the RNA or the proteins that are later produced. And a key piece for me is that when I'm telling the story, that underrepresented communities are part of how we're determining this information. So just moving forward, I hope to continue to delve into some of the work I've told you to provide some more clarity, to validate, replicate all of that as we're moving through that to show how lactation may be influencing maternal health, and to go a little bit beyond of just a lot of the work we have, a lot of the recommendations we have are infant focused, but what does the parent need to do to get the best health outcome out of it? Like, what is the duration that's important for them? What is the duration of exclusivity that's important for them? Understanding basic physiology to help with challenges of breastfeeding, to help make it easier for people to breastfeed, understanding low milk supply, things like that. So that's hopefully the work that will continue and probably be a lifetime. And moving forward, how do we work towards fewer disparities and improve outcomes for all families? Knowing that 2 out of 3 parent wean earlier than they had intended, and this is Tubi's work. And like I talked to you about, that there are common complications during breastfeeding, like low milk supply, engorgement, that we have not much data on how to best treat it, and how to help prevent some of these things to help our parents successfully breastfeed and breastfeed well and breastfeed with their mental health intact. Because we know that breastfeeding that's unsuccessful breastfeeding or not met goals can increase the risk for postpartum depression, or having certain challenges repeatedly can also increase risk. And so this is just an example of just looking at a common condition when we're looking at mastitis, and just like put out a clinical guideline recently. And while developing this clinical guideline on something that impacts a lot of parents, is the lack of information, is the lack of quality evidence, which is our priority for the parent in this work and what they need to be well. And again, the goal is not to force people. It's understanding that a lot of people do want to do this, but that a lot is needed to get people from their goals to success. Just like that video just beautifully illustrated, I couldn't do any better than that. That we need friendly, baby-friendly, or family-friendly maternity practices, supportive systems, social support system, informed providers, not just obstetric, but providers in general, ER, pediatricians, OB, lactation teams, and adequate and policies that that can help us get to a place where we have breastfeeding success and get to optimal rates. And some of the thoughts here is to commit, to educate, to support, to refer, advocate, and build capacity. That when we educate families, including extended families if they're available, communities, other professionals, and yourself, and making sure that what we're providing is as informed as we can be. That we support evidence-based practices, and express and support and promote breastfeeding, and refer when needed, and knowing the resources in our communities, and making sure our families know too. And as our previous speaker, so I don't want to say your name incorrectly, said, of just the gaps in the postpartum of and the needs in the first days, in the first couple of weeks postpartum for establishing breastfeeding success. Advocating and lending your voice for improved parental leave, for workplace support, improve access to pumps for working parents. And as Dr. As Bertel and Besruk said, that the lack of policies substantially benefiting early life or our postpartum people in the United States constitutes a grave social injustice, and that those who are already most disadvantaged in our society bear the greatest burden. So as we're going through and thinking through policies, and we need to build capacity, hiring staff who have expertise, providing opportunities for training, encouraging support for those who are the most needed, from communities who lactation support workers or peer counselors from places or communities that are most at risk. And this is part of the Lancet series, and this is a piece of their infographic of just the breastfeeding is not the sole responsibility of women, but our collective responsibility. And not running from the fact it should be protected, promoted, and supported through both our government and health organizations, with marketing of formula via like legislation and monitoring and implementation of the code. Increase regulation and transparency around lobbying, investment, which is key in maternity protection, in supporting breastfeeding at workplace, enforcing legislation that prohibit discrimination. And then healthcare systems and education that prioritize the parent-centered and culturally appropriate breastfeeding care, like having the woman and not just the infant, and the lactating parent, not just the infant, as a focus of support as well. Improving education and training and skill set of healthcare professionals, empowering parents and families to breastfeed as long as they wish, training providers and families on on behaviors after birth, so that they can have knowledge to prevent early introduction of formula. And for the mom's sake, for the parent's sake, that research that is maternal focused, understanding the why, so we can develop interventions that help understanding duration and recommendations that are both parent and infant focused. Maybe taking a pause of when we tell parents not to lactate because of infant contraindications. Are we suggesting that the infant's benefits are the only things critical? Is it still maybe worthwhile if the parent wants to lactate for their own benefit, even if the infant doesn't receive it? And we could talk about other ways like research or other things that the milk can be donated to. Being able to manage complications well and putting some energy into learning how to manage things like mastitis and engorgement that impact that parent, and a focus on policy and interventions that support and make this journey just a little bit easier. Your care and your support directly affects a parent's success. This is from our ACOG guidelines, and this is demonstrated both by observational randomized trials that what we do matters. So what will you do? Thank you so much.